Hello and welcome students to a new video lecture of English literature. I am your English teacher Anugya, and in today's video we are going to study a new chapter of your English literature book. The title of this chapter is The Selfish Giant. This chapter has been written by famous author Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was a well-known writer from Ireland. He has written many stories, novels, plays and poems. Here is an interesting story by him. Let us read further and find out how selfish giant changed into a friendly and caring giant. Every afternoon the children used to go to play in the giant's garden. The giant was not there. He had gone to meet his friend. It was a large, lovely garden with soft green grass. There were beautiful flowers that grew on the grass like stars. There were 12 peach trees in the garden. The birds sang sweetly on the trees, and the children listened to them in delight. They said to each other, "How happy we are here." The giant stayed with his friend for 7 years. One day, he decided to come back to his castle. When he came back, he saw the children playing happily in his garden. "What are you all doing here?" he cried in a gruff voice. The frightened children just ran away. "My own garden is my own garden," said the giant, "and I will not allow anybody to play in it but myself." So he built a high wall all around it and put up a notice board, "Trespassers will be prosecuted." He was a very selfish giant. Once upon a time there lived a giant in a town. He lived in a castle surrounded by a beautiful garden. Once he went to his friend's house to live for 7 years. Amid that, the children found a desirable time to intrude into his garden and have a good time. Every afternoon, they went into his garden and played there till evening. They rolled on the grass and climbed on the peach trees. They enjoyed listening to the bird songs. Each afternoon, they played in the giant's garden, and while returning every evening, they thought to each other that how happy they were there. But one day, all their enjoyment came to an end when the giant returned. He returned from his friend's place after 7 years. When he saw the children playing into his garden, he roared in a very gruff voice and asked them to move out. All the frightened children just ran away. He shouted that the garden was his own garden and he would not allow anybody to ever come in his garden. So he built up a high wall all around it and put up a notice board reading, "Trespassers will be prosecuted," which meant that anybody who would intrude into his property without his permission would be taken into legal action. He was a very selfish giant. Now the poor children had nowhere to play. They wandered all around the high walls when their school got over and talked about the beautiful garden inside. Then came spring all over the country. There were blossoms and birds. Only in the garden of the giant it was winter and snow and frost. The birds did not care to sing in it as there were no children, and the trees forgot to blossom. "I cannot understand why spring is so late in coming," said the selfish giant as he sat at the window and looked out at his cold white garden. "I hope there will be a change in the weather soon," but spring never came, nor did summer. Now, when the giant had driven away the children from his garden, they all did not find any place to play. They wandered around the high walls of the garden and talked about the garden inside in the upset mood. Then, after some time, spring came all over the country. There were blossoms and birds everywhere. But to everyone's surprise, it was still winter in the giant's garden. The giant was confused as well as worried to see the situation. But hopefully, he said to himself that the spring would come in some time. But the spring never came, nor did summer. One morning, when the giant woke up, he heard some lovely music. It was a little bird singing outside his window. It seemed to him the most beautiful music in the world. A nice perfume reached him. Hoping that spring had come to his garden, at last the giant jumped out of the bed and looked out. What did he see? He saw the most wonderful sight. Through a hole in the wall, the children had crept in, and they were sitting in the trees. The trees were so glad to have the children back again, and they had covered themselves with blossoms. The birds were flying around, chirping with delight, and the flowers were looking up through the green grass and laughing. Some children were playing on the grass. It was a lovely scene. Only in one corner of the garden it was still winter. A very small boy was crying, as he could not reach up to the branches of a tree. As the giant looked at the child, his heart melted. How selfish I have been, he said. Now I know why spring did not come here. I will knock down the wall, and my garden shall be the children's playground forever and ever. He was really very sorry for what he had done. One morning, when the giant woke up, he heard a lovely music coming from the window. A nice perfume also lingered around him. It was an indication that the spring had finally come into his garden. He was so excited that he jumped out of his bed and looked out of his window. To his surprise, he saw that the children had come into his garden and they were playing all over the garden. The trees were so happy and delighted to get their children back that they were all filled with blossoms. The grass had finally become green, which had flowers all around it. It was a very wonderful scene. But to his surprise, he saw that in one corner of his garden it was still winter. A little child was trying to catch hold of a tree branch, but he wasn't able to do it as he was really small. All, all this scene melted the giant's heart, and he realized that he had been so selfish that he drove all the children out of his garden, and this was the reason why spring did not bother to come into his garden. So he was very upset to see this, and finally he decided to knock down the wall and declared his garden to be the children's playground forever and ever. So he crept downstairs and opened the front door quite softly and went out into the garden. But when the children saw him, they were so scared that they all ran away. The winter came back again. Only the little boy in the corner did not run. His eyes were full of tears and he did not see the giant coming. The giant gently picked him up and put him on the branch of the tree. Birds came and sang on the tree, and there were blossoms on it again. The little boy flung his arms around the giant's neck and kissed him. When the other children saw that the giant was not wicked any longer, they came running back, and along with them came spring. It's your own garden now, children, said the giant. He took a big hammer and knocked down the wall. The giant decided to help the little child. So he crept downstairs and silently opened the front door and went quite softly towards the little child. But the children saw the giant coming. They all got scared and ran away. As the children ran out of the garden, winters came back. It was all hail, storm, and thunder. But the little child did not notice him coming, as his eyes were full of tears and he could not see the giant coming. The giant gently came to the little boy, picked him up, and put him on the branch of the tree. The little boy was overjoyed that he flung his arms all around the giant's neck and kissed him. When the other children saw this, they understood simply that the giant was not wicked at all again. So they came running back, and with them came the spring again. It was all blossoms and spring all over his garden. The giant said to the children that the garden is for them now, and they can come whenever they want. He took a big hammer and knocked down the wall. All day long the children played in his garden, and in the evening they came to the giant to bid him goodbye. Every afternoon, when school got over, the children came and played in the giant's garden. Years passed by. As the giant grew old, he sat on a chair and watched the children playing. He would say, I have many beautiful flowers, but the children are the most beautiful flowers of all. Now, the children had got their own garden, and every evening they came into the garden. Every afternoon they came into the garden and played till evening. During the evening time, they came to the giant and said him goodbye. As the giant grew old, he sat on the chair and watched the children playing. Now he had realized that he had a lot of beautiful flowers in his garden, but the ultimately most beautiful flowers were the children of his garden. That was all in the story. I hope you enjoyed this beautiful story. That was all for today's lecture. Thank you so much.